Well, let's start with some slides here. I took a lot of pictures when I was out there. I love the land. I love the American West. It's gorgeous, and you can see some museums along the way, so you get a sense of some of the way that their lives were, they were living their lives and how they were traveling. I won't have time to go through all of these. I will just mention one. This is a picture of their journals. Lewis and Clark kept voluminous journals. I've read a lot of their entries, but very few people probably have read all of them. It goes on for volume. Because of the 200th anniversary in 2004, there was a whole series of books that came out that were collections of their journals. So Lewis is actually a pretty decent artist, and part of his job, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, was to record some of what he saw there. So that's a picture, obviously, of a fish that he took. But let's go ahead and get into what happened in the Lewis and Clark expedition. I thought I would start with an entry from one of their journals. And this is very handy. I can do this probably almost any talk I ever get on any day because they were gone for 2.5 years, 2 years and 4 months. So I can pick a day, and today's May 5th. So literally, as Jupiter was driving us here, I went online, found what they wrote on May 5th, and give you a little taste of it. This is actually one of the more amusing ones. There are some funny things in their journals. I don't know that Lewis or Clark themselves were particularly funny, but some of the stuff they wrote about is kind of humorous. And this one, I think, has kind of a humorous bent to it. And those of you who heard me before know that I fancy myself somebody who has a sense of humor. So I want to enjoy a little bit of this. But first, a caveat. This is not my spelling. Those of us who are looking ahead thinking, this guy teaches English. No, this is William Clark's spelling. And William Clark is one of my favorite people in the world, but I can't imagine I would have been able to pass him in my English class. He really struggled with spelling. But he was brilliant in other respects. Obviously, he was a great explorer. He also was a brilliant, and I mean a brilliant, cartographer. He was doing the maps of the expedition, and it's remarkable. Modern cartographers will look at his work and say it's just amazing because he was doing this without anything close to modern instrumentation, but he was just a master cartographer, so he was able to draw these maps. But this is what he wrote about on the second May 5th they were gone. So they left in the middle of May in 1804, so they're gone for 1 year, the first May 5th, and then 1806. This is the second May 5th, 1806. While we were in camp last fall at the entrance of the Chapunish River, I gave an Indian man some volatile liniment to rub his knee and thigh for a pain of which he complained. The fellow soon after recovered and have never ceased to extol the virtue of our medicines. So of course these Indians didn't have access, they had their own medicines, but they didn't have access to Eastern medicines from the Eastern United States. Near the entrance of the Kuskuski, which I think is the Clearwater River is what we call it today, as we descended last fall, I met with a man who could not walk with a tumor on his thigh. This man also assigned the restoration of his leg to me. These two cures have raised my reputation. This is what Clark writes, raised my reputation and given these natives an exalted opinion of my skill as a physician. Now, Clark, again, was a cartographer and an explorer and a former military man. He was not a physician. I have already received many applications. In our present situation, I think it pardonable to continue this deception, for they will not give us any provisions without compensation in merchandise, and our stock is now reduced to a mere handful. So he felt a little bit dirty about pretending that he was this master medicine man, but they really needed something to trade with at this point. You're going to see in a few minutes, they brought a lot of trade items along with them because they knew they'd be meeting tribes along the way. They covered nearly 8,000 miles. And along the way, they're meeting tribe after tribe after tribe, and they want to establish positive relations with those tribes. And part of the way to do that would be to have lots of trade items. But remember, at this point, they've been gone for almost 2 years. They've exhausted a lot of their supplies of gifts and trade items, so it's a really good idea for Clark to be able to pretend to be a physician. And besides, apparently it worked because they were in love with his treatments. So that's just a little side note. It's May 5th today, so 1806, this is more than 200 years ago. This is what they wrote about, what Clark wrote about on May 5th, 1806. Okay, so I told you I'd give you a sense of what the keel boat looked like. This is a replica of the keel boat. And when I tell people that I did the Lewis and Clark Trail, I think maybe I set them up for disappointment because people ask me how I traveled it. So did I take a dugout canoe? Did I ride horses as they did? Did I take a buffalo boat? Did I stay in a fort? No, I travel by Jeep. But I did have the top down, if I get any points for that. So that's how I traveled it the second time. It's a glorious way to travel the American West because it's just so beautiful out there. Okay, so what happened before they got started? They started in May of 1804, but there was a lot of preparation that took place first. But first of all, let's ask ourselves why they were even out there. Well, we've already alluded to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And it was in 1802 that Jefferson had sent ministers to France offering to buy New Orleans. But instead, Napoleon Bonaparte, preparing for another war with England, had made a surprising counteroffer. He would sell the entire Louisiana territory, all 820,000 square miles, to the United States for $15 million. Now, if that gives you any idea of inflation, there are probably little plots of land out there in really prestigious parts that you would pay $15 million for today. Jefferson scored a huge deal. Even back then, this would have been a good deal for $15 million. It was a sum nearly twice the federal budget. But Jefferson was desperate to make a deal, and he did. It doubled the size of the country at that time. Well, now Jefferson wanted to know what was out there. And those of you who know a little bit about Jefferson may know that he was a scientist, he was an inventor, an immensely curious man. He wanted to know what was out there, not just for own curiosity, but also for the purposes of commerce, because he's thinking ahead. And one of the things he was really curious about, as were a lot of people back then, is there a Northwest Passage? In other words, is there a way to travel the entire continent to get all the way over to the Pacific Ocean by water? For years, people have wondered about this, but it was such difficult terrain and so large to navigate, nobody knew. So that was the number one priority for Lewis and Clark when Jefferson sent them on this expedition, was to find out, is there a Northwest Passage? Because if there is, that will dramatically increase the opportunities for travel and, more importantly, for transportation. Because as you can imagine, in the years before the train, Jefferson had no way of knowing that a train was coming. It was really only about 30 years later that the locomotive became a major way of transporting things. But they had no way of knowing that. So back then, travel by water, as difficult as that was really the easiest way to move a lot of goods. But that wasn't enough for Jefferson. He also wanted Lewis and Clark, he wanted his men, whoever these people were, he hasn't decided yet, but he wanted people to be able to draw maps and to make detailed observations, scientific observations of the soils, minerals, crops, animals, and the weather. He wanted someone to meet the Indians and record their languages, populations, religions, customs, food, clothing, and their willingness, of course, to trade with the Americans. So he wanted somebody who could do all of those things. In fact, he wanted someone who would have scientific knowledge of all of these things. He wanted a botanist. He wanted somebody who could serve as a botanist, as an anthropologist in some ways, as a zoologist, an astronomer. And he knew, as smart as he was, he knew that he would not be able to find anyone who could do all of those things. But he was willing to settle for someone who could survive in the wilderness and could learn as much as he could about all of those things. And as it so happened, he had a private secretary, a guy by the name of Meriwether Lewis. And that's how the connection was made. Lewis did not have any special credentials other than he could survive in the wilderness. He had been in the militia and then in the U.S. Army. And he, Lewis, had served under a guy named, you guessed it, William Clark. And that's how the two came together. So you might say it was a piece of luck for Lewis to have been the private secretary, and he was happy to make this journey, especially when he knew that he could invite his former lieutenant. So Lewis served under William Clark. If he could invite William Clark, then he knew that the two of them could work well together. So as I said, Jefferson knew it was impossible to find someone who had a complete science in botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy, joined the firmness of constitution and character, prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and a familiarity with the Indian manners and character. all of the latter qualifications Captain Lewis has. So he knew that Lewis would be able to survive in the wilderness, would be able to lead, and would have some of the basic skills, and he could learn everything else. And that's exactly what he sent Lewis to do. So he'd sent Lewis to study with the leading doctor at the time, Dr. Benjamin Rush, some of you probably know that name, to study with the leading botanist, Barton, leading botanist, with a zoologist, and with an astronomer, Andrew Ellicott. So he studies with all of these people in 1803 as he's preparing for the expedition. He spends a lot of time, not as much as he probably would have liked, but a few weeks here and there trying to learn, and then he has to collect all the supplies they will need. Because they're not going to travel by themselves. They're going to travel with about 3 dozen men along with them to be able to do everything they need to do for this expedition. So he invites his friend William Clark, who has Indiana connections that we talked about it a minute ago. So his brother, George Rogers Clark, lived in the Indiana Territory. Both of them originally were from Virginia. And as I said, Clark had served in the U.S. Army with Lewis. He was a lieutenant, so he was his commanding officer. Now they have to prepare. They have to put together all of these supplies. So as I said, Lewis goes to Philadelphia and he studies with all of these experts, and he spends the $2,500 Congress has approved for the expedition. He spends it on compasses, quadrants, a telescope, and chronometer, because they have to do some surveying and they have to be able to find their way. Saws, hatchets, chisels, fishing hooks, and cloth for tents, soap, portable soup, tablespoons, a corn mill, and, my favorite, 288 thimbles, 4,600 sewing needles. You didn't realize they were sewing to needlepoint, were you? Handkerchiefs, kettles, mirrors, 130 rolls of tobacco, and 33 pounds of beads. That last one's a giveaway. What are these things for? The gifts. These are the trade items. Now, that's going to run pretty quickly when you're gone for that much time, but they came and tried to be prepared for all of these things. So you can see some of these items that they brought along with them, a compass, the beads. That's just samples. Obviously, that's not 33 pounds of beads there. Just replicas of what their axes would have looked like, copper kettle. So those are just a few of the things that you can see that they were packing to go along with them. And they had a symbol of the crew. And so they had explicit instructions for what they wanted. They wanted stout, healthy, unmarried men. I honestly don't know why, except they thought maybe they just wanted people who would not be tethered back to the east. These were men who were willing to go out there and put their lives on the line, which they will do. Accustomed to the woods, obviously capable of bearing bodily fatigue. Yes, they're going to need that, and you'll see why in a minute. And eventually, it comprises about some 30 men. So they have 4 sergeants along with them. Sergeants Charles Floyd, Patrick Gass, John Ordway, and Nathaniel Pryor. And some of them kept journals as well. So we have massive documentation. Lewis, Clark, and I think all of the sergeants kept journals. So we have massive documentation of their journey. They had some privates along with them, an interpreter, because they're going to need some interpreting. Now, they're not going to be able to interpret with all these different tribes. Of course, the tribes are speaking all different languages. But if you have someone who could do a little bit of the translation, it's going to be helpful. And then York, who is William Clark's slave, comes along as well. So here they go. May 14th, they leave. 1804, they start heading up the Missouri River. Sounded pretty easy the way Clark put it in his journal entry. I set out at 4:00 p.m. in the presence of many of the neighboring inhabitants and proceeded on unto a gentle breeze up the Missouri. Sounds like a pleasant little camping trip, doesn't it? What he doesn't mention is that the Missouri back then, and of course these are modern pictures, but the Missouri back then was a monster. It was much stronger than the mighty Mississippi, so to speak. It's longer than Mississippi, and it carries all of the debris that it was collecting for half a continent because all the tributaries that were emptying into the Missouri. One person said that the Missouri entered the Mississippi like a conqueror. Nowadays, I think because of the damming and various things, it's not what it used to be, so we can't get a sense of this. But it was a powerful current, 4 to 6 miles an hour, that they had to go against because the Missouri River comes from the Rocky Mountains all the way across the west and then empties in the Mississippi. So there's a lot of water there, and it's a long ways, and the water is traveling, obviously, toward the sea, as rivers do. So that's a long way to travel upriver. And how are they going upriver? Well, if they're lucky, there's enough of a breeze, and that might have been why he was in pretty good mood here. A little bit of a breeze is going to push you forward because they did have a sail, but the breeze wasn't always strong enough to blow them, and it might not be blowing in the right direction. So sometimes they were rowing, sometimes they were pulling it from shore. This is a massive keelboat. It's 55 feet long, and they didn't have the technology we do today. And sometimes they were using giant poles and poling it along the bottom of the river. These men were burning 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. They had to be stout, healthy men, as we said a minute ago. So this was a major endeavor to go against the Missouri. And they will be going against the Missouri for the bulk of their journey, because the Missouri goes all the way, as I said, into the Rocky Mountains. Everybody knows Mississippi goes directly up from New Orleans. So the Missouri empties into the Mississippi, and it goes roughly northwest until it gets to Bismarck, roughly north of Bismarck, North Dakota, and then it travels fairly well west. So it wasn't the most direct route they could take, but it was the best one because they could travel by water. So they're hauling all of their supplies in the keelboat, most of their supplies in the keelboat, and they have a couple of other smaller boats that are called pirogues. Look about the size of like a modern day ski boat, runabout type boat. And they're traveling against the current. So the 55-foot keelboat held a lot of the supplies, but as I said, they were rowing, tugging, poling, and occasionally sailing the boat. And in addition to the fatigue they were experiencing, you can imagine the diseases: dysentery, snake bite, boils, and heat stroke. And then when they get up to Fort Mandan, they spend the winter. Probably a good idea. You don't want to be traveling the Missouri River in that area. Anybody ever lived in that part of the country where you think it's cold here? You all could tell us stories, couldn't you? At one point when they are in, this is modern day North Dakota, north of Bismarck. It's called Washburn, is the area where they stayed. This is a replica. We don't have the original one because it wasn't really built to last, but there is a nice replica there. If you decide to do some traveling, you can see a replica of Fort Mandan. Mandan is named after one of the Indian tribes there. December 17th, the temperature drops below 40 below zero. Now back then, they never heard of wind chill. So that's actual temperature. I don't know what the wind chill was. Nobody will ever know what the wind chill was, but I'm sure it was pretty windy out there on the plains. And as Clark says, he commenced a map of the country on the Missouris and its waters, and he's going to draw a lot of maps along the way. So they stop there and they start camping in the Mandan village. Then they have to build the fort. The fort's not already there. They have to build the fort. And then on April 7th, after the winter time, so they've been there for several months, they send the keelboat back down the Missouri with some of the specimens they've collected so far, including a prairie dog, which they call the barking squirrel. I think that's a better name than a prairie dog. I don't know how we came up with prairie dogs. It's not a dog, but it does sound like a barking squirrel. They were fascinated with this one. And that prairie dog lived to get all the way back to Washington, D.C. In fact, there's a children's book called A Prairie Dog for the President. And that's the idea they sent. And they sent lots of other things back too, because remember, Jefferson really wanted to know what was out there. So they sent the keelboat back, and you think, okay, well, how are they're gonna move now? Well, now they can travel. They still have the pirogues, and they can also travel by canoes. So they have to make their own canoes, obviously, and they can start traveling west on the Missouri now that it has come unfrozen, because obviously it's been very cold during the winter. You can, in addition to seeing the outside, you can also see replicas of what it would have looked like on the inside. And this is still preserved for us, so that's kind of a fun thing to be able to see what it would have looked like, get an idea of what their desk would have looked like and the various materials that they brought along with them, and an idea of what some of the maps would have looked like. So they get along pretty well with these tribes. Actually, in all of the Indians that they met along the way, there were only maybe 3 or 4 kind of close encounters. the Lakota and the Sioux was a very powerful tribe back then. So they were in a position where they could exert some force over Lewis and Clark. Fortunately, they were able to make it out of that conflict. And they had a few little run-ins here and there with the Blackfeet, for example. But for the most part, they were able to maintain fairly friendly relationship with the tribes, including the Mandans and the Hidatsas, who were here in this area in North Dakota. This is what Lewis wrote on February 6, 1805, while they're staying there. Visited by many of the natives, and among others, the Big White, the Cole, Big Man, Hairy Horn, and the Black Man, I smoked with them, after which they retired, a deportment not common, for they usually pester us with their good company the balance of the day after one being introduced to our apartment. So apparently the Indians were a little bit too friendly for Meriwether Lewis's taste. I think sometimes he could be kind of a loner. I don't know if I'll have time to get into this now. I think there's reason to think that he suffered from bipolar disorder. But we won't get into that right now. We don't have time to get into that now. But Clark seems like he was the one who was a little bit steadier.
Isn't it, going back one, isn't it Sacagawea a woman?
Yes, and wait till we get to her. She's actually one of my favorite parts of the whole story. In fact, you got ahead of me. This is the very next slide. So that's Sacagawea. Sometimes she's known as Sacagawea. But according to how Lewis and Clark wrote their journals, and they're going to sound it out, right? Because they don't know how to spell this, and the Indians didn't have a written language. So the way that they wrote it out, it's more likely that it's pronounced Sacagawea. So that's how I always pronounce it. This is one of the many images you can see of her along the way. But this is what happens. Clark wrote on November 4, 1804. So remember, they've only been there for a very short time. Clark writes, a Frenchman by the name Charbonneau, that's not how it's spelled, but Clark didn't know how to spell it, who speaks the Big Belly language, visit us. He wished to hire and inform us his 2 squaws, so we had 2 wives, were Snake Indians. We engaged him to go on with us and take one of his wives to interpret the Snake language, and that wife was Sacagawea. That's why Sacagawea gets to go on this journey. They didn't bring her from the beginning. They encountered her when they got to the area of the Hidatsas and the Mandans. So they're there spending the winter, and they get to know Sacagawea and Charbonneau. And both of them potentially can bring something to the journey, because Charbonneau speaks French, and you could use French as a way to translate into the languages if you knew somebody who spoke French, and then that person could also speak a native language. But Sacagawea spoke the language of the Snake Indians, because she was one of them. Now, the Snake Indians lived much farther to the west. She had been abducted as a girl when she was just, like an early teenager. And so she'd been abducted and brought to 1,500 miles away, back to North Dakota. And that's where she's living with Charbonneau, who has taken her as a wife. So it occurs to Lewis and Clark, she speaks a language we're going to need, because when you get to the Snake Indians, or the Shoshone is what we know of them as, the Shoshones had horses. And Lewis and Clark knew enough about what they were getting into to know that they were going to need horses. So it would be very advantageous to have someone who could speak that language and do some translation. As it turns out, this is one of the things that was even luckier than they could have anticipated, but we'll get to that. Well, it gets even more interesting, because while they are staying there, you've got Charbonneau, you've got Sacagawea, and Sacagawea, it turns out, has been expecting, and she gives birth to a child. Well, what are they going to do? They want her to come along. She's got a newborn infant. The newborn infant has to be with its mother, so hey, let's bring him along on an epic journey across the Rocky Mountains. I'm not joking, and I'm not trying to politically correct when I say that Sacagawea's ability to travel across the West, literally carrying this baby on her back and her arms, is the most remarkable part of this entire journey. So all you mothers out there, you deserve some credit, and so does Sacagawea. She not only managed to survive the entire journey and take care of her child, she also turned out to be something of a hero. We're going to see that in just a moment. So this is really one of the most remarkable parts of the journey. They're going to travel along anyway, and Sacagawea is taking this baby, born on February 11th. They leave 2 months later. It's a 2-month-old child riding on Sacagawea's back. And there's a wonderful sculpture. This is out at another fort that they stayed at, Fort Clatsop, which is out in Washington. You can actually see this beautiful sculpture that gives you an idea of what was going on there. So now they're ready to head off across the plains. April 7th, they're ready to, it's still going to be bitter cold there, but they're leaving Fort Mandan and they're traveling across the plains. So they get off to a hopeful start. This is what Meriwether Lewis wrote on April 7th as they're leaving. We were now about to penetrate a country of at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden. Good or evil it had in store for us was for experiment yet to determine. And these little vessels contained every article by which we were to expect to subsist or defend ourselves. It was an epic journey, and they were leaving April 7th, 1805, and now they're traveling almost due west into this. I love this image because it gives you an idea of what Lewis and Clark were getting into. This, of course, is the eastern part of the United States. This is how much people knew in the West about the American West. It's a giant blank. And we're going to see what that posed to them in terms of their challenges. They had heard stories. They knew something about the West from fur traders or from Indians, but they really didn't know that much. And so now they were going into this giant blank across the Great Plains. Well, as I said, Sacagawea turns out to be a hero. Her husband was the goat, and I don't mean greatest of all time. I mean an embarrassment. This is what happened when he happened to be at the helm of one of the boats. This, by the way, in one of the museums you can see, and there are lots of little museums and stuff you can see, there's one that's really cute. It's got dioramas, so you can kind of get an idea of what things would have looked like along the way. So this is a diorama image of what this episode looked like. So it's May 16th, 1805, so they've traveled probably several hundred miles now west, traveling on the Missouri River. And this is what Lewis wrote. It happened, unfortunately, for this evening that Charbonneau was at the head of this pirogue, and a storm hits. Charbonneau cannot swim, and is perhaps the most timid waterman in the world. Well, it doesn't go well. Charbonneau is crying to his God for mercy, had not yet recollected the rudder and do his duty, nor could the repeated orders of the bowsman, Cruzat, bring him to his recollection until he threatened to shoot him instantly if he did not take hold of the rudder and do his duty. I'm actually writing a column about this for my Mind Inclined podcast that I've told you about in a previous one. And Charbonneau was really the model of panicking. Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea were the models of composure, especially Sacagawea and Clark. Lewis apparently occasionally lost his cool. Clark was a rock, and Sacagawea was too. So during this incident, Meriwether Lewis, for some reason, almost never called Sacagawea by her name. He always called her the Indian woman. But that's what he's writing. He says, the Indian woman, to whom I ascribe equal fortitude and resolution with any person on board at the time of the accident, caught and preserved most of the light articles which were washed overboard. So while her husband is panicking, she's thinking, hey, we need to retrieve these things. It's no small matter. She literally still has Jean-Baptiste in one arm, and she's retrieving the items they need with the other. And these are no light items. These are the items that Meriwether Lewis literally wrote were the things they were required for them to succeed in this journey. So we sometimes hear about Sacagawea pointing the way and leading them across the West. Not so much. She did do a little bit of that, but for the most part, she was really helpful in terms of having this sense of composure and being able to help with knowledge of the land, and in this case, actually perhaps even saving the whole expedition. These are items that they desperately need. And I don't know if you can see it from where you're seated here, but the diorama has captured her reaching down and grabbing these things. She's sitting in the boat. There are so many stories I can't tell them all about Lewis and Clark journey, but this is one of my favorite ones, and it's a beautiful picture. You can actually go there. I took this picture standing up on a bluff and looking down. They're traveling along the Missouri River. Remember the giant blank they're going into. This is how much they know about, virtually nothing. They know there are mountains out there. They know the Missouri River travels to the west. They don't know whether it'll take them all the way to the Pacific Ocean because, again, remember, Jefferson thinks there might be a Northwest Passage. So they're going into this blank and they're just traveling along the Missouri River. Well, if you've traveled rivers very much, you know that rivers sometimes have tributaries going into them. Well, if you don't have a map and you don't know where you're going and you come to a fork, you can't take Yogi Berra's tip. Do you know what Yogi Berra said when you come to a fork in the road? Take it. I love Yogi Berra. But in this case, they had to decide which way to go. So they asked the men, and every man is making speculations about which way to go, and virtually every single one of the men thought that they should go to the right. Because if you look to the right, that was really muddy, just like the Missouri was. But there were two people who thought, I think we need to go to the left. Their names were Lewis and Clark. Fortunately, they were right. And their logic was probably sound in retrospect, in that they noticed that to the left, the water was clear because it had come from a clear stream. So that was the correct way to go. If they had made a mistake and gone the wrong way, probably would have ruined the entire expedition because they didn't have time at this point. Remember that they're traveling, it's taking a long time to make all these travels. This is June 5th. They still have to get to the mountains, and you don't want to be in the Rocky Mountains in the wintertime. So it's good that they made the right decision. Okay, my all-time favorite story about what happens on the Lewis and Clark journey is what happens when they come to the Great Falls. Anybody been to Great Falls, Montana? Okay, so don't spoil this for me. This is what Meriwether Lewis wrote about the Great Falls. He had heard about the Great Falls. He knew as he was approaching them. So Great Falls, Montana is roughly western Montana. This is what he wrote about them. From the reflection of the sun on the spray or mist which arises from these falls, there is a beautiful rainbow produced, which adds not a little to the beauty of this majestically grand scenery. After writing this in perfect description, and it goes on longer than I've got here, I again viewed the falls and was so much disgusted with the imperfect idea which it conveyed of the scene that I determined to draw my pen across it and begin again. In other words, this was so spectacular, he just didn't feel that he could capture it in writing. Okay, flash forward to when I'm traveling there in 2004. I love waterfalls, don't I? I've got a soft spot for waterfalls. And I am so pumped about seeing this waterfall, the way Meriwether Lewis described it. So I'll never forget, I'm walking up there, oh, I'm gonna see this. It's a trickle. It's been dammed up. So I was disappointed, but I'll have to admit, I was not as disappointed as Meriwether Lewis because he got to enjoy the beauty of the falls. But remember, they're traveling against the current in canoes. So they're gonna have to portage around the falls. Okay, Lewis was ready for that. He knew he'd have to portage around a set of falls. What he didn't know is that there was another set of falls, and another set of falls, and another set of falls, and another set of falls. There were 5 sets of waterfalls. Remember, they're traveling into a blank. They didn't know where they're going. They had heard there were falls, but they didn't know there were 5 sets of falls. So they have to wind up carrying these dugout canoes, portaging them with all their supplies for 18 miles. Over prickly pear cactus and dried ruts, tearing up their shoes. At one point, I think it was during the portage, when they got caught in a hailstorm. You've heard of golf ball size hail? Ever heard of softball size hail? This is what was raining down on them. They managed to make it. And remember, Sacagawea is carrying that baby because there's no way they can travel any easy way. They don't have horses at this point. They can't use their canoes. They're traveling 18 miles around these falls. One of my favorite stops along the way is a museum in Great Falls, Montana, and they have a giant diorama, a life-size diorama of the men hauling their canoes, these dugout canoes, up the side of the hills. Because of course it's going to be up. They're waterfalls, right? You're going around, so you got to go up. You can hike out there. I did some hiking. I wasn't trying to pull a dugout canoe behind me. So I had the easy way. I was just walking along here, but I did take a picture of some of the prickly pear cactus that they were trying to walk over. At every halt, these poor fellows tumble down and are so much fatigued that many of them are asleep in an instant. The exhaustion is beyond anything that we can imagine. In the afternoon, a dreadful hailstorm came on, which lasted half an hour. Some of the lumps of ice that fell weighed 3 ounces and measured 7 inches in circumference, raining down on them as they're trying to portage around these falls. Well, they know there are mountains coming. And Meriwether Lewis, even to this point, is still hopeful. He says, "I therefore did not despair of shortly finding a passage over the mountains and of tasting the waters of the great Columbia this evening." I have to chuckle. He didn't taste the waters that evening. After refreshing ourselves, we proceeded on to the top of the dividing ridge, from which I discovered immense ranges of high mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered with snow. When you're going into a blank, you don't know what's ahead of you. It's probably good that he had some hope, because you need hope to thrust you forward. But those hopes, as I say here in my headline, were dashed, because when he gets to the point where he can actually see what's ahead, he sees mountain after mountain after mountain covered with snow. And now they have to cross these mountains in the cold with Sacagawea's baby. So now they have to get over the mountains. Again, this is a picture from the diorama I mentioned earlier. And this was probably, as many difficulties have I explained here, this was probably the hardest part of the entire journey, because now they're traveling. They do have horses now. They were able to secure horses from the Shoshone. Not enough horses for everyone, but this is treacherous in the snow for these horses to be able to traverse. Some places so steep and rocky that some of our horses fell backwards and rolled 20 or 30 feet among the rocks, but did not kill them. Now, in some cases, the men killed them because they had to have something to eat. So they're killing their horses because there's not enough to eat along the way. And this goes on for weeks as they try to cross these mountains. Ordway, one of the sergeants, wrote, "The mountains continue as far as our eyes could extend. They extend much further than we expected. We proceeded on." I love this sentence, "we proceeded on." It comes up over and over and over. Clark uses it, Ordway uses it. I just can't help but think that this must have been something they were all saying to each other as day after day after day, trial after trial, challenge after challenge, disaster after disaster, we proceeded on. Lewis himself wrote, "I find myself growing weak for want of food, and most of the men complain of a similar deficiency and have fallen off very much." But they made it. Now they were starving, and they were so hungry when they finished this traverse of the mountains. They got to some Indians on the other side at the Wapie Prairie, and they got a hold of some camas roots, which are just what they sound like, roots that grow on the ground, kind of like beets or another kind of root vegetable, and they're starving. And they ate too much of them, and then they got sick on that. And it's like you couldn't win. Either you're starving or getting sick on your food. But they made it. And now they've got some boats to go down the Columbia River. So they did not find a Northwest Passage. They had to travel by river to river and portage and so on and so forth, but they finally got to the Columbia, and now they're going downstream. So that's the good news. The bad news is more waterfalls. Now, the most famous person to write about the Lewis and Clark expedition is Stephen Ambrose. He's probably better known for Band of Brothers, but he also wrote I won't say it's the best known book about, and it's a good one. I've read another one I think I probably like even better because it's more thorough, by a guy named David Lavender. But Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage is probably the best known book about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I love the way he wrote about their traversing of these falls. Okay, so they had to go around the falls going up the Missouri, but when they're going down the Columbia, then they could take their chances. And I guess they were in such a hurry, and maybe they're so tired of portaging, that they tried to run these falls. Well, listen to how Ambrose described it. "By the standards of today's canoeists, this was a Class 5 rapid, meaning it could not be run, even in a modern canoe specially designed for whitewater. They didn't have modern canoes. They had giant dugout canoes. So a class 5 rapid is one that you don't try to run because you can't do it. The natives, expert canoeists themselves, did not believe Lewis and Clark could do it in their big, heavy dugouts. This is my favorite part. They gathered by the hundreds along the banks to watch the white men drown themselves and to be ready to help themselves to the abandoned equipment afterward. But to the astonishment of the Indians, the Americans made the run without incident. Miracle. So they make it down the Columbia, and now they have to stop, and they stop at Fort Clatsop. Now they had to decide on where they were going to camp for the winter. So again, it's a long journey. It takes a long time to go up the Missouri River, especially when you're dragging a keelboat. So this journey takes a long time. They finally get to the coast, and they have to decide where they're going to stay, because they're not going to try to go back over the mountains. Remember, they made it to the Pacific, but they're not going to live there. They got to go home. Now they thought, believe it or not, they thought, and this is not a crazy thought, it was possible that they might catch a boat, because there were boats going that way from the Pacific. So they thought maybe they could wait it out, and they'd catch a boat, and then they could just take a cruise ship home, so to speak. So November 24th, all the travelers, including York, who's a slave, and Sacagawea get to vote on where to camp for the winter. Pretty remarkable. Again, they have to build this fort. And again, you can see a replica of Fort Clatsop. So it's fun to visit there and see what it looked like. Anybody ever been to the Pacific Northwest? What does it do there? Yes. And I think maybe Lewis and Clark had some idea, but they weren't ready for this. So you can read their journals. January 1st, rain. January 2nd, rain. January 3rd, rain. January 4th, rain. They spent 106 days at Fort Clatsop. It's a little over 3 months. It rained on 94 of them. Now, I told you that Clark had wonderful composure. He was a rock. This is the only time in all the journals I've read when it looked like Clark might be about to lose it. Not from panicking, but just from wearing them down day after day. And remember, they don't have Gore-Tex. They're living with the technology of 220 years ago, and they're probably just getting soaked. I didn't mention the fleas, and I didn't mention the mosquitoes they were experiencing earlier in the journey that were so thick they were getting in their throats. I'm not making this up. They wrote about all of these in their journals. But they did survive. That's the good news. The bad news is, did the cruise ship ever show up? No. So they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and it never came. So after all they've been through, the dysentery, the boils, the fleas, the mosquitoes, I didn't mention the bears, the run-ins with bears, the starvation, the portaging, the exhaustion, the hail, the traversing the Bitterroot Mountains in the cold, the sickness on the Camas routes. Well, now it's time to go back. They had made it halfway, and now they had to turn around and go all the way back, which they did. Now, the only good news is that the Missouri River, of course, now they're going with the river, so they're going a lot faster. But I got to hand it to Lewis and Clark, especially Meriwether Lewis. After all they've been through, not only did they have to make it back, Lewis actually decided to do some more exploring on the way back. And he writes about this. He could have taken the shortcut. No, Clark, hang on. I want to check this out. So he'd go like another 100 miles north to check out this, check out that. Now, maybe he was just afraid that when he came back, Jefferson was going to be on him saying, well, yeah, that's great, but what'd you find out about the Yellowstone River? Because this is what Jefferson wanted. He wanted as much detailed information as he could get. And to some degree, he did get it. The journey produced not only all of these journals and maps, and hopefully some good relations with some of the Native Americans, but also they discovered 122 previously unknown animal specimens, species. So they were doing real science out there, and 178 unknown species of plants. So they were doing botanical work and zoological work, and they were exposing much of the American West to the people back in the East. And there was a lot of, for lack of a better word, ignorance back then about what the West was like. Some people believed that there were still woolly mammoths out there wandering around. But Lewis and Clark really set the record straight to some degree because they recorded all of these things that they found with their drawings and their specimens, the things they sent back on the keel boat. So they did a massive amount of science while they were out there. Well, I've got a few minutes left. If anybody has any questions about the Lewis and Clark expedition or comments,